welcome you all to the session at the American Literature Association. I'm Sławomir Studniarz, a published scholar. Currently, I'm a member at large at the Poe Studies Association, and I have the honor of moderating this session. And I will introduce each speaker in turn, and then moderate the Q&A session. So let me introduce our first speaker today, or maybe a few words about the topic of the panel: Poe's Environmental Humanities. And this is a panel organized by the Poe Studies Association. And I think that the topic of the panel is acutely relevant nowadays when we're facing an imminent ecological disaster. So this area of interest is tracing the relations, sensitive and tricky relations between the human and non-human agents is very, very important nowadays. And it shows Poe's relevance for the 21st century, right? The relevance of his work. So our first speaker today is Jordan Constanza from the University of Wisconsin. She obtained her BA and MA at the University of North Carolina, and her research interests include 19th century American literature, with a special focus on Edgar Allan Poe and American Gothic, but she's also interested in Scandinavian literature and in Foucauldian studies. And the topic of her paper is the non-human agent and aggressor in the fall of the House of Usher. So, Jordan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll go ahead and get started. From the onset of the fall of the House of Usher, Poe makes it clear that the line between the human and non-human is not so much blurred as it is non-existent. Environmental symbolism is especially significant in his rendering of organismic imbrication. The eponymous collapse of the title refers to a double signification: the end of both the Usher family bloodline and the estate in which they dwelled. That Roderick and Madeline Usher, the last surviving Usher members, and the house die in near simultaneity is not coincidental, but rather indicative of the insidious connection that the three entities share. The symbiotic relationship that binds the Usher estate to the twins, and by extension the Usher bloodline, is one of a parasitic nature. And it is this parasitism whose corollary is the weak generational reproduction of the family that ultimately engenders the final fall of the houses of Usher. Poe grants additional agency to the tarn and its capacity to subsume that which surrounds it. So by characterizing and psychologizing his landscape with what Jane Bennett would call vibrant materiality, Poe posits the non-human world in the fall of the House of Usher as both agent and aggressor. The first glimpse of the Usher estate feeds directly into the environmental symbolism that's prevalent throughout the story. The landscape is imbued with an inexplicable melancholia that pervades every aspect of life. In approaching the estate on a, quote, singularly dreary tract of country, the narrator is immediately struck by, quote, an utter depression of soul akin to the afterdream of the reveler upon opium. His awareness is instant as he ponders the strange reaction of his instincts, and then he forfeits his contemplation of the house to its, quote, power that lies among considerations beyond our depth. This indication of power in the supposedly inanimate is only one part of the mansion's true secret: its parasitic sentience in relation to the Usher family bloodline. That the house and its inhabitants are intimately connected is no subtle thing. In fact, quote, the quaint and equivocal appellation of the House of Usher is a moniker used by the local peasantry to denote, quote, both the family and the family mansion. Seemingly anecdotal, this designation is a smokescreen to the far more sinister nature of the family's connection to the land, and vice versa. The ancient Usher family is introduced by their history of startlingly weak genealogy. Quote, the stem of the Usher race had put forth at no period any enduring branch, so that the entire family lay in the direct line of descent. The mainspring for this dynastic stagnation is attributed to a, quote, constitutional and family evil. Roderick and Madeline, the last two surviving members of the family suffer from this unnamed, undiagnosable, and incurable evil in peculiar ways that allude to the ushers playing host to a life-sucking parasite. The powerful and ongoing exploitation of their life force could arguably illuminate the conundrum of the usher's moribund lineage. The parasite feeds just enough to maintain its satiety while avoiding ultimate extinction of the bloodline. That is, until Roderick and Madeline's generation, the final Usher generation. The parasitic connection linking the three entities, Roderick, Madeline, and their estate, is symbiotic to the point that they are three parts of one being. This symbiosis is manifested in two ways, the most obvious being an appearance, so that each entity is a narcissistic image of the others. The house is eerily personified to mirror the twins, described as having vacant eye-like windows and a Gothic archway. Its bleak exterior, which is discolored with age, is segmented by minute fungi overspread in a fine tangled webwork and a fissure that extends from the roof into the jaws of the lake. The perimeter of the house is surrounded by rank sedges and decayed white trees and faced with a small and sullen lake that is bound by, quote, a precipitous brink. In parallel, Roderick is described as having a ghastly pallor, thin lips with a surpassingly beautiful curve, tortured eyes, a hooked nose, and wild, unheated hair of a more than web-like tenuity. Madeline, though without lengthy description, is noted by the narrator to have a, quote, striking similitude with her twin brother, leaving her as the aesthetic pair to Roderick. The likeness is shared between all three entities is clear and purposeful. The pale decay, the strange eyes, which are the windows, sharply lined mouths, which corresponds to the tarn, angular noses, the entryway, and withering and colorless hair, which are the sedges and trees. The sheer change of Roderick, and by extension Madeline's appearances, is mentioned with bewilderment by the narrator. And this unnatural progression, or rather deterioration, can be attributed to the house's parasitic power as it feeds off the bloodline for which it's named. The second half of the symbiosis is manifested in the health of the entities. The narrator often dismisses Roderick as the hypochondriac in lieu of using his name, and it's this apathetic dismissal that poignantly highlights the twins' declining physical and mental health with the estate's unnatural influence, and later the direct parallel between the near simultaneity of the deaths of Roderick, Madeline, and the house. The grim and cheerless manner with which the Usher twins spend their final days is the result of their parasite, the House of Usher, or the family evil. However, rather than a seemingly inexplicable ailment that weakens both twins at a steady and alarming rate, it is the common denominator, that which has essentially culled their entire bloodline. The intradiegetic poem of the Haunted Palace, relayed by the narrator to Roderick, the latter of whom is implied to be the last descendant of the poem's monarch, functions as a prophetic narrative of the Usher race. Once grand and radiant with, quote, spirits moving musically, the palace is eventually visited by, quote, evil things in robes of sorrow, so that through the pale door a hideous throng rush out forever. The poetic metaphor here is indicative of the Usher appellation and the two concepts it constitutes, and its sure descent from grandeur to expiration. In addition to prophecy, the poem within the story also operates as the catalyst for the story's big reveal of animism. Poe blatantly allows for the reader to be spoiled with regard to his secret evil by hiding the reveal in plain sight. By having Roderick, characterized as the hypochondriac abandoned of his mental faculties, unravel the mystery, Poe is able to mislead the reader without having to mislead at all. Instead, that diversion tactic rests on the unreliable narrator and his perspective through which the reader experiences the narrative. The evidence of the mansion's sentience and parasitism, Roderick argues in vain, is, quote, that silent yet importunate and terrible influence which for centuries had molded the destinies of his family and which made him what he now was. So spot on is he in his diagnosis of the supernatural that, naturally, the narrator once more dismisses his thoughts as madness. However, it's Roderick's deduction that ultimately elucidates the secret that has long shrouded his bloodline and the current chain of events. The house, the vegetation that crawls over it, and the tarn which reflects back a mirror image of the estate altogether possess a parasitic and sentient power that has sucked the life from its inhabitants until it has left only two vessels from which to spawn additional hosts, vessels that are so weakened by the generation's worth of parasitic influence that they simply cannot reproduce. And thus the parasite has signed its own death warrant, for by taking too much life it now inadvertently takes its own. The final moments of the ushers occur in rapid synchronicity, and it is this inexplicable concurrence that ultimately drives the theory of the Usher bloodline, represented by the twins, and their estate being malignantly connected through a shared existence. And this existence is marked by its interdependence upon foremost the parasite and secondarily the hosts, so that what happens to the one is mirrored against the others in life and death. Only mere moments after Madeline and Roderick die in simultaneity, their corpses intertwined upon the floor, the mansion's, quote, mighty walls rush asunder to embrace its hosts in shared mortality before finally being drawn into the bowels of the tarn as their final resting place. In one fell swoop, the Usher race is extinguished and every last remaining vestige of their legacy decimated by the perverted symbiosis forced by their malevolent environment. Undeniably strange and parasitic, the red string of symbiosis that links the fates of the Usher members to their namesake is apparent in two overarching ways. The myriad parallels among the story's three entities, namely in physicality, mentality, and mortality, and the bloodline's inexplicable reliance on singular branches as opposed to multiplication. And it is this quasi-homogeneity in conjunction with the feeble Usher family history that supports the likelihood that the estate was actually a genus loci cum Fisher kingdom, a sentient environmental parasite affecting its inhabitants, exploiting the bloodline to feed itself until, inevitably, its host is no longer sustainable. Initially symbiotic to the detriment of its humans, the mansion's prolonged leeching is ironically what puts the last nail in its coffin and finalizes the unity of effect between both the literal and metaphorical houses of Usher. That's it.
Okay, thank you very much. That was a condensed version of the paper, right? So thank you, Jordan, for this fresh eco-critical perspective on the fall of the House of Usher. I think we'll postpone the questions for the final part. So now let me introduce the second speaker, Scott Zukowski, if I'm right, if I pronounce it correctly. So Scott is a researcher from Library of America, where he's editing two volumes, one on Frederick Douglass and the other on Black writers of the founding era. He recently completed his PhD, which received the English department's Best Dissertation Award. And his current book project studies the reciprocal influences of periodical culture and some of the 19th century most important American literary figures, including Edgar Allan Poe. And his paper has, let's say, a zoocritical perspective because it explores Poe's Ourang-Outang and the ecological ethics of the 19th century. So let us hear the presentation by Scott now.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Jordan. That was a really great presentation. I'm going to share my screen and then get started. Okay, actually, Jordan, since you're still in my screen, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see okay, cool. So I want to open with an excerpt from a scientific travel account published in London in 1818. It's by the British surgeon and naturalist Clark Abel, who in 1816 and 17 served as the lead medical officer on a British expedition to China. While the expedition's purpose was diplomatic, Abel's was scientific, as the ship stopped in Madeira, Brazil, the Cape of Good Hope, Borneo, Korea, Japan, and various upriver areas in China. Abel recorded detailed observations of the flora and fauna he encountered along the way, and he collected a huge array of specimens for study, specimens that would mostly be lost when the expedition's ship struck a reef and was subsequently plundered by pirates. Nonetheless, some of his specimens survived the ordeal and the remainder of the trip home. And Abel published his 1818 account of the entire voyage, striking at the public's scientific and globalized imagination. And the one part of that 400+ page narrative that seemed to endure in the public's mind longer and more intensely than any other was his account of an orangutan that the expedition captured in Borneo and brought back onto the ship with them for transport back to England. He describes how the orangutan was sometimes friendly and showed remarkable intelligence and human-like qualities, eating with the sailors, playing with them, even sharing a bed with Abel himself. Something that I keep thinking I need to get into Melville with that, but that's another topic. But outside of its natural habitat, the creature could also turn hostile. And here's an excerpt. The orangutan became violent when put into a large railed bamboo cage for the purpose of being conveyed from the island. As soon as he felt himself in confinement, he took the rails of the cage into his hands and, shaking them violently, endeavored to break them in pieces. But finding that they did not yield generally, he tried them separately, and having discovered one weaker than the rest, worked at it constantly till he had broken it and made his escape. On board ship, an attempt being made to secure him by a chain tied to a strong staple, he instantly unfastened it. And then a little while later, although so gentle when not exceedingly irritated, the orangutan could be excited to violent rage, which he expressed by opening his mouth, showing his teeth, seizing and biting those who were near him. These two quotes highlight the orangutan's behavior during its darker episodes, which may have been precipitated further by its eating of human food and its drinking of coffee, tea, wine, beer, milk, liquors, and spirits, including the captain's brandy that the creature stole. They also result, no doubt, from confinement, from its removal from its habitat, and from the unusual climates that the expedition passed through, including cold temperatures around the Cape of Good Hope, and surely back in England as well. And it'll be too hard for me to go back and forth and stop sharing my screen, so I'm going to continue sharing it for now. Abel's account was excerpted and reprinted countless times by periodicals around the Atlantic over the coming months, years, and decades. I see his narrative as a landmark event in the cultural fascination with the orangutan that had already been developing in Western culture for decades. I attribute this at least partially to developments in print culture, faster methods of printing and distribution, expanded networks of circulation, cheaper paper, and a continued expansion of the number of newspapers and magazine publications in the first few decades of the 19th century. Abel's account followed earlier ones like Edward Tyson's 1699 Orangutan CV Homo Silvestris, Arnaud Vosmer's 1778 Beschreibung, Thomas Smith's 1806 Naturalist's Cabinet of Animal History, and others, which themselves also described captured orangutans that slept like humans, ate at tables with them, swung from ceiling rafters and ship rigging, stole and drank alcohol, and prompted scientific and philosophical questions of humanity and its past. By the 1820s and 30s, there frequently appeared in circumatlantic newspapers factual and fictional accounts of sailors, globetrotting traders, and scientific researchers kidnapping orangutans from their natural habitats and living with them in human settings thereafter, for better or worse. In fact, between 1790 and 1830, the frequency of phrases like orangutan increased about 900% in books, and over 20 plays about orangutans appeared in the US, Britain, Germany, or France between 1790 and 1840. And their tours and periodical advertisements generated even further excitement and intrigue over the animal. Publications in these countries and around the Atlantic world printed and reprinted narratives about and artwork depicting orangutans in their natural environment, orangutans in transport to Europe or the US, and orangutans suffering in the new environmental and social climates of their new homes in Western cities. Three common themes in these accounts are: first, the death of the orangutan, often reported either indifferently or with some degree of pity. Second, the orangutan's remarkable intelligence and seeming humanity approached Give me 1 second. My screen has just sort of exploded on me. Oh no. It's definitely time for a new laptop. Bear with me. My apologies. Okay. So second, the orangutan's remarkable intelligence and seeming humanities approached both with awe for the scientific and for the romantic. And third, the orangutan's dark romantic turn to violence in response to human corruption. This presentation is part of a book chapter I'm writing that contextualizes the figure of the orangutan in Edgar Allan Poe's 1841 Murders in the Rue Morgue in 19th century periodical and literary culture as a symbol of environmental health, hope, and horror. And leading, I hope, to a new and important perspective on Poe's fiction and his engagement with circumatlantic periodical culture. It places Poe's famous detective story in a transatlantic web of intermedial intertextuality, of periodical print and reprint culture, and of literary adoption and adaptation. Scholars before me, like Thomas Mabbott, E. Kate Stewart, Robert Mitchell, Burton Pollen, and others, have studied the periodical and natural history influences on Poe's story, but most of that work was completed before the advent of digital searchable periodical and media databases exponentially expanded the scope and efficiency of such research. Thus, I believe that my research, encompassing thousands of pieces of orangutan-related literature from the late 18th and early 19th centuries, will help us arrive at a comprehensive cultural view of the context from which Poe's orangutan emerged. This is still very much a work in progress, but I hope to demonstrate that the orangutan was a critical tool for Euro-American writers and readers of various genres and media to consider their relationship to a vast, ecologically changing world, increasingly accessible through technology, empire, and print circulation. It was also a tool for those same readers and writers to critically consider humanity, human history, and developing notions of human evolution. I approach this subject most significantly from a periodical studies perspective, and as a relative newcomer to Poe studies, I consider myself honored to be a guest on this panel. With that in mind, one of my key goals here is to gain feedback from the Poe experts themselves on topics like Poe's engagement with periodicals, his composition process, and any primary or secondary resources that may be useful for my project. And I want to say that I would not try to refute the arguments of so many scholars who've studied the racial significance of the orangutan in Murders in the Rue Morgue. If anything, my periodical research in the orangutan's cultural history has only convinced me further of just how intertwined the history of race is with the 19th century phenomena of travel literature, environmental exploration, scientific expedition, various conceptions of human history and evolution, and empire. It's worth pointing out that two of the most common references to orangutans in late 18th and early 19th century periodicals are first, considerations of the orangutan as a missing element in a still nebulous understanding of the various branches of human ancestry and descent. Euro-Americans obsessed over this topic and analyzed the orangutan for what it might tell them about perceived racial differences in humans. This, for example, is a pretty well-known diagram showing the angles for drawing skulls and heads of monkeys, orangutans, Central Asians, and Angolan Africans. The second most common references to orangutans during the first decades of the 19th century was the comparison of somebody's character or intelligence to that of an orangutan. Writers compared their antagonists to orangutans, politicians gave their opponents the nickname the orangutan, and people of all sorts characterized as orangutans those whom they perceived to be inferior. But it's important to remark that the orangutan was as much a symbol of inferiority as it was a symbol of human purity, of a sort of proto-Adam still existing in a quasi-Edenic garden of Borneo. Thus, to encounter an orangutan was to encounter a living artifact of the pre-modern, pre-lapsarian world. And here are some illustrations that sort of capture that. These cultural uses of the figure of the orangutan are all at once tied to pseudoscientific ideas of race, to emerging ideas of human origins and ancestry, to a sense of the distant global regions becoming ever more accessible, to a sense of the growing difficulty in distinguishing here from there and us from them. That people like Clark Abel or Charles Darwin circled the globe, exploring the individual species as well as the collective environments they found there, bringing back specimens for study and display, highlights at once the divide between and the merging of Euro-America and those distant regions. In the early 19th century, urbanization, modernization, and rapidly expanding international marketing, postal, and trade networks also brought new environmental and scientific considerations to the general public's attention. As more travelers returned home with goods, narratives, and most importantly for this presentation, wild animals from distant regions of the globe, demand increased for more goods, more information, and more chances to see exotic animals like the orangutan. Museums, traveling shows, and early zoos showcase orangutans and advertise their exhibitions with ads like these. And often, newspapers announce the landing of a ship with an orangutan on board. Sometimes newspapers covered the expected arrival of an orangutan for weeks or months in advance of its actual arrival, and readers surely followed along with anticipation, sometimes to be disappointed by articles like the following. I have shipped on board the Octavia in orangutan, or the real man of the woods, which is what orangutan translates to. This animal is, I suppose, one of the greatest curiosities that has ever been sent to America. I have known one sold in London for the sum of 10,000 pounds sterling. This animal is very tender of the cold weather, and great care should be taken that it is kept in some warm apartment. The animal is about 5 years old, and with good care will still grow much larger. He came originally from the island of Borneo and will eat almost anything that is offered to him. And then, as this was a reprint, the orangutan mentioned in the above extract died after the ship anchored on Thursday night. So I want to pause and point out two elements of this not uncommon account. First, aside from its value as a curiosity, the orangutan is valued monetarily, and quite expensively at that. This, of course, will be one of the justifications that the Maltese sailor gives in Murders in the Rue Morgue, that in taking the orangutan captive and bringing it back to Paris, he hopes to reap a, quote, fortune, like anybody in his modest financial situation would do, he says. This is a defense of the individual through a defense of empire and colonialism. We can exploit other lands, other peoples, other environments, other natural resources because it makes us money, or keeps prices low, or keeps our pantries stocked with spices and our wardrobes stocked with desirable fabrics. I'll also point out here that orangutans in Borneo are currently under dire threat by the astounding expansion of plantations that produce palm oil for our cosmetics, soaps, shampoos, chocolate, pizza dough, ice cream, cookies, instant noodles, packaged bread, and margarine, among many other things. Second, this article cautions against the orangutan's climatic disruption, tangentially acknowledging the trauma that environmental change would inflict on it. Its death, of course, is presumably a consequence of that environmental disruption. We can see clear parallels between this sailor's story and the Maltese sailor's story in Murders in the Rue Morgue. But I want to return here to the longer scientific and adventure accounts that I mentioned earlier, the ones that describe a captive orangutan aboard a ship headed for the US or Europe. They seemingly always describe the animal's appealing human qualities, its dexterity, and its volatility. And this is, I think, is this the right slide? Okay, here we go. Arno Vosmer described Dutch Prince William V's orangutan, for which he was its caretaker in Holland, as such. One morning it got unchained, and we beheld it with wonderful agility ascend the beams and rafters of the building. It was not without some pains that it was retaken, and we then remarked an extraordinary muscular power in the animal. On shipboard, it ran freely around the vessel, played with the sailors, and would go, like them, into the kitchen for mess. At the approach of night, it lay down to sleep and prepared its bed by shaking well the hay on which it slept and putting it in proper order, and lastly, covering itself warm with the coverlet. Another account states, while on board the vessel, it frequently ran up the rigging and played a variety of antics aloft to divert the company. It could leap with surprising agility from one rope to another, though 15 or 20 feet asunder. If we return to Clark Abel's account, we find more of the same common elements, as well as one other key feature that I want to highlight. Abel's description of the orangutan's body is extremely detailed, dedicating pages to its physical characteristics, its anatomical dimensions, its color, its hair, its hands, its fingernails. Here's a measurement chart that Abel appended to his lengthy descriptions of the creature. I find several parts of Abel's account important for an intertextual and intermedial analysis of murders in the Rue Morgue. First, these very details that Abel presents and analyzes with such a fine forensic eye are the same details that lead Dupin to solve the crime. It's clear that Poe is a consumer of scientific accounts of orangutans, which were known to debate the actual characteristics of the animal, largely because of misunderstanding of what an orangutan was and was not. It was often confused with the chimpanzee, for example. And as a result of that debate, often focused on minute details and characteristics. And second, I also believe that Poe saw great value in the travel literature, science literature, periodicalized extracts, tours, and plays that until this point seemed to create a perfect buildup to his story. Accounts of orangutans in the wild, accounts of orangutans swinging on shipmasts and rigging, accounts of human-like orangutans living in human settings, and accounts of the potential of orangutans for a sort of Gothic violence in those settings. Prior to Poe's story, numerous stories did appear in periodicals or otherwise about orangutans attacking people in African or Southeast Asian environments, but never attacking white people in Europe or the US. The centrality of periodical literature is all the more illustrated by the newspaper article that Dupin submits in order to find the orangutan or the sailor. He reports finding a very large tawny-colored orangutan of the Bornese species. The owner, who is ascertained to be a sailor belonging to a Maltese vessel, may have the animal again upon identifying it satisfactorily and paying a few charges arising from its capture and keeping. Here, Dupin directly participates in the decades-old periodical discourse about sailors capturing orangutans from Borneo and bringing them home to the West. And it's no surprise that his article helps bring further illumination to the crime. It's the very print and periodical network we've been discussing that leads to the story's solution. And of course, Dupin is only a character within a fictional story within the real-life Graham's magazine, itself a participant in that same web of print and reprint culture. To be clear, I'm less interested in the potential argument of what stories Poe consumed or which stories influenced him most. It seems nearly impossible to pin down exactly what he may have read or not read, experienced or not experienced, especially in print culture, in which one text might appear dozens or hundreds of times across decades, publications, and continents. What I'm more interested in is what we can derive from placing Poe's orangutan in this circumatlantic, intermedial, intertextual, adoptive, and adaptive conversation about orangutans. In that conversation, they were, of course, dexterous animals with human qualities. But if that conversation also identified orangutans as a sort of pre-Adam, pre-Lapsarian proto-human from an untouched paradise, quote, in the distant regions of the South Pacific, then perhaps we can conclude that exploitation of global peoples and environments is not altogether different from reenacting the fall. Or if orangutans were so commonly used as a figural tool to mock the intelligence of one's opponents, then what does it say that Poe's orangutan outsmarted virtually every human character in his story? To continue along this line, is it really such a compliment to the brilliant Dupin to say that he had the wisdom or insight to catch an animal so often mocked for its inferiority to humans? What do we do with the fact that despite being identified as the killer, the orangutan is left to live in the zoo rather than be executed for its crimes, while the capitalist, colonialist sailor may or may not be culpable for his involvement? I leave off with these questions that I'm still continuing to explore through my analyses of orangutan literature from around the Atlantic world. I thank you all graciously for your time and for any thoughts, feedback, or suggestions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott, for this.
Stop sharing my screen.
Okay. For the sharing with us this very thorough and exhaustive research on the image of the orangutan. Just a word before we move on. So the appearance of the orangutan in Poe's works is not limited to the murders in the Rue Morgue. You might also want to consider the system of Dr. Tar and Professor Feather and the hop frog, yeah, where also the orangutan is used for specific purposes. Okay, so now I'd like to introduce our respondent, Professor Lesley Ginsberg from the University of Colorado. She is the co-editor of the volume Romantic Education in 19th Century American Literature. She has published several book chapters on Poe in American Gothic, New Interventions in the National Narrative, recently also in the Oxford Handbook of Edgar Allan Poe. She's also interested in eco-critical studies because she has published a chapter on Hawthorne in Eco-Gothic in 19th century American literature. So now it's time for a respondent to offer us a survey of this session. So Lesley, the floor is yours, please.
Okay, well, thank you, and I hope you can hear me and that the technology is working. Thank you to Amy, Professor Armiento, for organizing and doing the tech support for this session. I thank Professor please forgive me. Studniarz for organizing the panel, for the Poe Studies Association for inviting me to respond, and for ALA to allow us to do our session this way. Certainly back when we were trying to decide about traveling, it wasn't clear at all whether we'd be vaccinated or like what was happening. And so I thank ALA for allowing us to do this, and also for all of you for being present virtually here today. So thank you. And in a way, it's kind of a cliche already with environmental work to situate oneself, but I'm going to situate myself, as zooming with you from the American West. I'm on the ancestral territories of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho nations. And we're in the middle of a 20-year mega drought, which you may have heard about. And it's June, and it's very hot here for June. And I've lived through 2 Junes when we've had wildfires, and I have to say I'm anxious about that. And when I think about the environment, I'm thinking about my environment, the risk of wildfire. It's lovely out. And the thing about drought is that, it's nice out. It's hard, sometimes it's hard to tell when a drought is happening because it's incremental. But the effects of drought, though they can be hard to be seen on a daily basis, it nevertheless is part of a slow-moving environmental disaster that is no less critical just because its effects are larger and harder to grasp. As Poe's Dupin might say, its significance may be a little too self-evident. The narrator of The Pit and the Pendulum is an apt figure for the situation of contemporary humans as deadly climate tipping points inch ever closer. Poe's deep skepticism about 19th century American scientific materialism and disdain for platitudes about progress is reflected in a host of his works, as John Tresh has recently demonstrated. Poe's skepticism about the 19th century and its degradation of nature and its perversion of the relationship between the human and the non-human are at the core of Poe's tales. And I'm thinking of tales such as Four Beasts in One or The Colloquy of Monos and Una, whose apocalyptic visions of a future of, quote, smoking cities, where, quote, green leaves shrank before the hot breath of furnaces, has been cited as a prescient vision of our current predicament by Matthew A. Taylor and Sarah Crosby, both of whom have written persuasively about Poe's environmental humanities. As Michelle C. Neely reminds us in her recent book, Against Sustainability, Reading 19th Century America in the Age of Climate Crisis, Poe's America was not and never was a pastoral utopia. In Poe's day, America had a long history of raising commodity crops and meats for export that exhausted soils. Sylvester Graham's 1829 expose on the dangers of the antebellum diet, is fundamentally about the sexuality he sought to control, but reveals a mechanized society of global consumers who favored highly refined flour products, commodity meats, and adulterated industrially produced bread. Just as we cannot romanticize 19th century American connections to the natural world, Matt Sandler reminds us that in Poe's present of dying colonialisms, Poe offers us a picture of the psyche absolutely divided from its surroundings, in which nature, community, and law all threaten human flourishing. Scott Zukowski's paper firmly situates Poe's 19th century in its transatlantic and global capitalist contexts, in which the circulation of texts mirrors the circulation of goods. Zukowski uses data analysis to show how in the 40 years prior to the 1841 publication of The Murders in the Rue Morgue, references to orangutans in Anglo-European print cultures grew tremendously, including the production of plays about the creatures. Zukowski shows that these references followed a common narrative pattern, which also appears in Poe's stories. But the reward of data is not merely to demonstrate Poe's participation in larger print culture trends, but to assert that the fad for orangutan narratives allowed Euro-American writers and readers of various genres and media to consider their relationships to a vast ecologically changing world, in Zukowski's words. Further, Zukowski considers the inextricable links between antebellum global trade and the trade in humans that provided the foundations of empires in Poe's day. He shows how discussions of orangutans were linked to ideas of white racial superiority and its concomitant myth of Edenic prelapsarian humanity to be found in non-white populations or wild creatures. Here, Zukowski's paper evokes the work of scholars such as Lee Person and Courtney Novostat, who have explored the orangutan and the murders of the Rue Morgue as a symbol of the murderous rage of the enslaved, or as a patriarchal id enforcing heteronormativity in a tale that features the deaths of women and at least one beautiful woman. But Zukowski teases out the commodification of orangutans and the way that these creatures are described as both human yet not quite human, a blurring that evokes antebellum slavery's unholy dehumanizations. In so doing, Zukowski shows us how the context of orangutan narratives allows us to think about a work typically classified as detective fiction in terms of its environmental contexts. The slippage between human and non-human, and indeed consideration of the non-human as an actor and a larger and more important ecological presence, is a key component of environmental humanities. While Zukowski convincingly asks us to rethink the limits of genre by showing how a work of detective fiction also invokes 19th century environmental realities, Jordan Costanza's paper takes the destabilization of the human-non-human binary in The Fall of the House of Usher as the starting point of her reading of the story. Costanza's paper is allied with Branka Arsik's reading of The Fall of the House of Usher, in which things, quote, possess the vital capacity to self-transform, sense, and enact sensations. They are not simply mobile mechanism, but rather actors endowed with sensuousness and capable of generating perceptions of their own qualities in others. For Costanza, the non-human in Usher is inextricably linked to the human in an eco-Gothic dance of destruction. In her words, by characterizing and psychologizing the landscape with what Jane Bennett would call vibrant materiality, Poe posits the non-human world in The Fall of the House of Usher as both agent and aggressor. In the words of Andrew Smith and William Hughes, who were among the first to use the term eco-Gothic in their 2013 collection with that title, the eco-Gothic challenges romantic conceptions of nature by illustrating how nature becomes constituted as a space of crisis, which conceptually creates a point of contact with the ecological. The year before this collection was printed, Matthew A. Taylor highlighted the presence of ecophobia in Poe and his contemporaries in his groundbreaking 2012 article on the thin line between the love of nature and the fear of nature in antebellum American literature. In conclusion, it is worth noting that the journal Gothic Nature was launched in 2019, that it now joins venerable journals such as the Interdisciplinary Studies in Literature and the Environment, shows us that there is much more work to be done on Poe's environmental humanities. The papers we heard today contribute to this new and vital approach to Poe studies. Thank you for your attention to this provocative new work presented today.
Thank you very much, Lesley, for this synthesis. Very interesting, and I hope that it will inspire a fruitful and thought-provoking session. Now, I would like to open the Q&A session now. So, yeah, I think that we should follow certain rules. Let's hope that it somehow will work out. So. The idea, well, Jeff Savoy is the first to raise his hand, so please, Jeff, yes?
Yeah, so I have a couple observations and a question for Scott. I actually also have a question for Jordan, but I will take a pause in case someone has a question between mine. So one thing Scott had said was that Dupin may not be so brilliant for catching an orangutan since they don't seem to have been very clever animals. I think that's a rather hasty reading, in that Dupin's brilliance is not in catching the orangutan, but in solving a mystery that nobody else was able to solve. The orangutan just happens to be the actual culprit in this case. The police rush to judgment and arrest someone without actually even being able to explain how that person might have accomplished the murder. So Poe's through Dupin is showing the brilliance of solving the crime. The orangutan just happens to be a device, I think. I share your interest in early periodicals. It's good to see that others are taking advantage of electronic resources for these things. We sort of have an abundance of magazines and periodicals that are being scanned now, although it must be a fraction of what is actually available. And that is probably a fraction of what was available in Poe's time. Source studies are always problematic because unless you can really show directly in something that we know Poe wrote and admitted that he saw or read a particular source, just because something is mentioned before Poe mentions it does not a source establish. Historically, we've often had a problem in the scarcity of alternate sources. Now it seems that we may have the opposite problem of too many suspects, and I kind of wonder how you're planning to deal with that.
Yeah, too many suspects. As I've tried to condense, I mean, when I say, well, to rewind a little bit, I first came across this topic maybe 4 years ago, and have slowly, very piecemeal, just been like chipping away at it as a hobby project that's turned into something more, I think. But at that point, even just talking about access, I was using my university's databases on early American newspapers, I think, the Redex Index. And I thought that at one point I was like, okay, I've got everything covered right now. I've searched, you know, every newspaper that's digitally available, and that was in like 2019. And now, as I no longer have access to that same database at Stony Brook University, where I did my PhD, I've been using New York Public Library's same database, but vastly expanded. And it's made me think, my goodness, so my data that I was looking at the start of this project is so much more limited than it is now, which creates two problems. One is the amount of time that it takes to go through all these literally thousands of periodicals and read through just to even save the PDF before even thinking critically about what it is that I'm reading. And then the other thing, as you say, is what to do with all these suspects. And that has been on my mind for the past few weeks as I've tried to consolidate all of this into, and I'm still working on all that newspaper research. But looking, I think I tried to focus more today on not necessarily newspaper accounts as much as longer accounts that were printed in books and then excerpted in newspapers. That is a temporary solution, but I found that those longer accounts may have been, well, again, to your point, I wanted to say they may have been inspirational, but they at least were often excerpted and seem to exert a little bit more long-term control or presence in the transatlantic print culture during that time, just simply perhaps because they were printed in a bound volume that wasn't so ephemeral. And beyond that, wish me luck. I'm not sure I have a great answer just yet, but this is part of what this project entails.
And it may actually even be worse than you realize, because if you're relying on searching text behind a lot of these periodicals that are scanned, especially for newspapers, the OCR is often gibberish.
Much to my dismay.
Yeah, the tiny print of newspapers does not really scan well, particularly if it's faded and damaged in any way. That's just sort of the nature of the beast, if we can call it that.
Yeah, some scans are fantastic, as you know, as I'm sure all of you know, and some are based off of microfilms from what must be the 1950s or so. And it varies tremendously. And not to mention that spelling of orangutan it varied so much. And then the fact that there was very little scientific agreement about what an orangutan was, whether accounts of orangutans were sometimes actually accounts of chimpanzees or another kind of ape. And it gets very, very difficult in here. Thank you for acknowledging that.
It's also true that one thing you see is for anything that was of sort of prurient interest or a filler item, these periodicals all cannibalized each other. Often, 10, 15 years later, they might almost verbatim reprint something that they just grabbed from another thing. And when Poe was doing stuff for Burton's Gentleman's Magazine, he was using the same thing, scissors and paste to try to put together things that were really cobbled together from things that had already been printed before. It was standard practice.
Absolutely. If I don't want to take up too much time with this, but one thought that comes to mind is I first discovered this Clark Abel's account in Freedom's Journal, which was the first African-American owned and operated newspaper. And that might be a direction that I go in with this project, because to reprint an excerpt from that account in a paper explicitly dedicated to conversations about race and to improving the station of our 500,000 brethren, or whatever the mission statement was, really helps us think through some of these questions, I think.
Okay, so we have another question to Scott by Stephen Rackman. So shall I read it, or Stephen, would you like to ask this question directly?
Sure, I'll read it. The question was simply, does anyone in your research discuss the linguistic abilities or non-linguistic abilities of orangutans? My understanding is that they do not actually have a voice, but since there's this discourse about prelapsarian discussions, do they touch on Babel or other biblical types of contexts for thinking about this prelapsarian man?
Yes, and wow, I haven't made that connection yet. And that's a great connection. They totally do. There are people who actually say, I taught the orangutan to speak. I taught it the English language, or I taught it French. And I've kind of just been passing by those references and not thinking much of them. I haven't, as I said, I haven't had much time to digest yet, but that opens up a wide avenue for pursuit.
Yeah, the interesting thing is that there are many witnesses who hear the orangutan producing some sounds, and each of the witnesses attributes the source to a different foreign language. So there's this idea of imitating, a human. Okay, thank you very much. I would like to now move to Jordan. She wants to ask a question, but I think that Jeff was first, and he has a question to you. So, Jeff, question to Jordan?
Well, yeah, for me again, part of your presentation, maybe it was my hardware, was you were sort of breaking up a little bit, and I may have missed where you actually explained this, but I got the impression that you were saying that the shared force behind Roderick and Madeline and the house was some sort of parasite. Could you correct me or explain that a little bit better?
Yeah, I'm sorry that I broke up. That's really unfortunate. I was worried about that. Yes. So essentially at the core of it, I was arguing that there is a parasitic relationship being shared amongst the twins, which obviously represent the entire lineage of the Usher family and the house. So yes, yeah, parasite.
Well, are you saying that they are parasites to each other, or there is an independent parasite that is sort of preying on all three?
In this reading, I saw the Usher family as the host to the house's parasitism. So the house is feeding off of the life force of the Ushers, which explains why they have such a weak genealogy, but also incest is a factor in that, and explains why they die off. Yeah,
and why the house itself is essentially consumed once it has succeeded in killing its hosts.
Yes.
No background origin explanation for where this parasite would have come from, or you don't need one.
Jeff, if I may offer, a comment. I think that there is also a very interesting area here in the story is the blurring of the boundary between the animate and the inanimate, because Usher himself has this strange fancy that he shares with the narrator about the condition of the sentience that he attributes to the walls of the house, in the arrangements of the stones, and he speaks directly of this oppressive influence of the house on his family. So, but also, I think another manifestation of this, I'm not sure if it's parasitic, but definitely poisonous influence, is this miasma, the villainous miasma that emanates from the tarn. And I think that maybe the source of this parasitic influence, or maybe the source of this destructive, power, maybe the tarn rather than the house itself.
There's been a lot of interest in Poe's interest in Lucretius, and I think that makes a lot of sense out of Usher in a way that very, very little else does. Of course, your comment about miasma is valid because, of course, in Poe's day, they thought bad smells caused illness. One of the reasons Poe's family moved in Baltimore from where they were in the Fells Point area over to the house on Amity Street was to get away from sort of the Inner Harbor area after his brother had died. So.
Right. Thank you. And Jordan, you have a question, yes? Am I right?
Yeah, I was just going to ask Scott something really quick.
Okay, please.
So I'm not as familiar with the Murders in the Rue Morgue as I am with Poe's other stories. So I apologize if this doesn't make sense. But when you were showing the newspaper clippings that described the orangutan, it reminded me of some 19th century slavery advertisements I looked at very recently. And then also what you said about the orangutan being confined to the zoo as his conclusion. It made me think of racial implications further. So considering that African Americans have historically and derogatorily been compared to apes in order to dehumanize them, and especially in the light of the Black Beast theory, which explores the vilification of the Black man as a sexually violent beast, do you think there's a worthwhile link to be pursued between the zoo that the orangutan ends up in and the American prison system, which obviously sees a disproportionate amount of Black people incarcerated?
Wow. Wow. That's a wonderful, amazing question. Yeah, I don't know where to start. Yeah, absolutely. I'll say talking about the comparison of African Americans or Black people worldwide to apes of one sort or another, that is an explicit conversation happening in these newspapers. It's not symbolic. It is literally talking about what are the differences, what are the similarities, and using the word orangutan as, I'm trying to think of an appropriate way of saying this, using it as a term, a derogatory term directly applied to a Black person. And there is the recurring image, one on ships, of a jail, the bars that the orangutan tries to break. And then, of course, in the zoo also. And I intentionally included that quote about the orangutan shaking on the bamboo bars because I thought it was so provocative, thinking mostly just of the slave trade, and that this is so symbolic of an African kidnapped from West Africa and then put on board a slave ship and trying to get out, and then it ends up in the West. But I hadn't made the connection to current incarceration issues. And I'm really glad you bring that up, because really one of the first things that drew me to this project was watching PBS and BBC documentaries on nature. And anytime that the Borneo comes up, the orangutan is there, or anytime that the orangutan comes up, Borneo is there. And anytime that either of those comes up, environmental destruction and deforestation comes up. And so I really started to be interested in this because I was thinking, well, how can I tie this to current events, and how can I make this maybe a public piece of writing rather than what's turned into something more analytical? but you give me now another angle to think about. So that's a really long way of saying, wow, tremendous, awesome.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from John Grusser, yes, so please.
Hi, Jordan. I love your work. I love that article you did on childhood readers. I think it was originally a paper at one of our post sessions, and your paper today was great too. I want to just think a little bit about about Roderick as a host, and then in connection with the parasite. You referred to the narrator as unreliable. And there's a whole group of critics who see that narrator as unreliable. There's a whole group of critics who see him as reliable. But I'm just wondering if we think about the narrator as someone who is being hosted by Roderick and by the house, does he then potentially become a kind of parasite too? The narrative.
I really like that interpretation, because I had a difficult time figuring out where to put the narrator in all of this, because he's obviously important, but I couldn't really pinpoint where he fit into the parasitism. But I would say that his relation to Roderick, although they're supposed to be old friends, it has more of a negative connotation to me than it does positive. Just because of the way that he does dismiss Roderick so easily. But I do like that interpretation of him being a part of the parasitism, because at the end, he's the only one who survives of everything and everyone that has to do with the Usher lineage. So yeah, I know that's not an answer, and I'm sorry, well, but I do like that.
If we believe him, of course,
Yes.
Because, that's the thing about being unreliable. Are you completely unreliable or partially unreliable? There's a great old essay by J. Harris Miller called "The Critic as Host," which talks about a host and a parasite. That could be useful to you as well if you want to pursue this.
What was his name?
J. Harris Miller.
J. Harris Miller. Okay, thank you. Yeah, and also thank you for the compliment. I really appreciate that. About the article, because I think I remember actually emailing you once by suggestion of Dr. Daniel Shealy a very long time ago. So yeah, that means a lot. Thank you.
And seeing as I'm hogging the floor here, I love, Scott, how you ended your paper with the question about what happens to the ape and what happens or what doesn't happen to the sailor. So the sailor seems to be at least partially responsible for the brutal killings of two women, and yet he profits by selling the ape at the end, and there don't seem to be any other negative consequences. And we see this pattern of women victims in Poe's detective fiction, and there are no consequences for any of the perpetrators as far as we can tell.
Okay, thank you. We have two more questions. First from Paul, and then from Travis. I hope that we'll have the time to pursue this. Okay, so Paul?
Yeah, I was just thinking about Jordan's thesis and about Usher as the sort of quintessentially ambiguous Poe Gothic story, in the sense that your reading seems plausible to me, but not in a way that excludes many other ways of thinking about the story. In fact, if we insist on that reading, it seems almost to me more like an H.P. Lovecraft story. That's how he would have told it, and he would have meant it, right? Or even Jordan Peele's version of H.P. Lovecraft, something that really literalized the danger. So when you're talking about a parasite, you aren't talking metaphorically, but I think you often are in Poe, because that feeds the ambiguity. Take that as a question.
Yeah, I like what you said about it not necessarily excluding other theories, because whenever I was practicing this on my roommate, who is also a literature grad student, I stopped in the middle. I was like, this could also, I guess, be an umbrella under which you could include the vampire theory of the Ushers as vampiric, and also brings to the forefront the incestuous nature that's sort of teased at but not overtly confirmed necessarily between not only all of the Usher members but the twins especially. That perversity there, that could be a consequence, I guess, of the parasitism. So yeah, that's not really an answer, but
Thank you.
Okay, and Travis?
I have a comment and a question. So related to what Scott said about carceral imagery in The Murders in the Rue Morgue and Jordan's insights into that imagery vis-a-vis race, I think it's also important to note that Murders in the Rue Morgue is a Philadelphia tale, and a spot on the cityscape was Eastern State Penitentiary, which got a lot of attention in antebellum America. Amy has written a great essay about Poe's Philadelphia and these spots that he knew, and some of them were medical institutions and carceral institutions. So that reality might be useful for you, Scott, as you further think about the world that Poe inhabited and all of the discourses at work in his mind when he penned Masque of the Red Death. My question for Jordan, Jordan, I really was fascinated when you started to talk about the absence of a line between the human and the non-human, absence of a line between the human and the non-human in Fall of the House of Usher. And I immediately thought about Prospero's failed effort to separate the human court from natural peril. Do you think that Masque of the Red Death is a variation on environmental themes introduced in Fall of the House of Usher?
well, that's a really good question. I'm not sure about its connection in that way. I actually almost did submit submission for Masque of the Red Death, but then I fell back on Fall of the House of Usher. I would probably have to think more about that and brush back up on Masque of the Red Death since it's been a little while since I've read it. But yeah, I'm sorry. I feel ill-equipped.
Infection and pestilence, right?
Yes.
It's being both. And what you said about the narrator, there's that great Fall of the House of Usher. There's that great line in which he actually says that Usher's condition infected him.
Yes.
So
yeah.
To kind of follow up with what John said earlier, it seems like there's a lot that you can work with there as well.
Yeah, especially since the proximity to the Usher family and the house seems to, it doesn't seem to weaken the narrator, but he feels sick just being around them and ill. So yeah, that infection is like very prevalent, and I think that would be a great link between Masque of the Red Death and Fall of the House of Usher. Yeah.
Right, and the narrator is not only physically infected, but I think most importantly, he is infected by Roderick's frame of mind in the way that he begins to share his very strange vision of the surroundings, sort of. Okay, I think we're coming to an end of this extremely interesting session. So I'd like to thank all those who have been involved, especially the presenters, the respondents, and the participants who contributed to the questions, and the invisible manager behind the screens, Amy Bremiento, who sort of has managed to put all this together. So it has been a real treat to moderate this session. So thank you all, and see you maybe next time in person.